Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben. Today on the show, we've got Dr. Josie Collins from the Tizard Centre in the UK. Welcome to the show, Josie.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I just always like to do a quick little land acknowledgement. So I'm producing this podcast on the lands of the Tla'amin, Comox, Clahuth, and Homoko people, who were one people before colonizers came over and separated them all into reserves. They used to all live together as sort of one community. They became separate First Nations over the years. I usually, when I do my land acknowledgements, I sort of share about the connections I'm trying to make with the Tla'amin Fire Department, because I've mentioned before, I'm also a firefighter here on Sayayin, which is called in the Tla'amin language, but Texade Island is what it's called. It's named after a Spanish conqueror who actually never came to Texada. He just kind of sailed by, and someone said, let's call it Texada. But Sayayin is the indigenous name, which the name escapes me what it means. I knew before, but essentially it refers to a land on the sea in some way. I know I'm butchering that. And it's apt that today we're going to be talking about topics including fire setting. But in terms of the work we're doing with the Tla'amin folk, we're moving a little bit closer to developing some joint harm reduction programs between our island and the Tla'amin First Nation, as well as kind of this transition house for women and children that's over on the mainland. We're trying to come up with some collaborative ways of connecting folks that are in need, especially when we're doing like kind of first responder calls and whatnot. We come to families that are domestic issues and often some really sensitive sorts of things. And we're on an island; we have no access to resources and whatever. And so Tla'amin has been really helpful in kind of helping us with creative ways to sort of provide support. So I'm enjoying continuing that relationship. So I'm just grateful to be here. And I'm grateful to Dr. Collins for coming on the show. So once again, thanks for being here. Most of the guests I've had on this on the podcast have either been kind of behavior scientists or autistic folk, because we're trying to I try to get more kind of perspectives of the consumers as well as the professionals. But I've really been trying to kind of branch out some more into areas that I think are applicable to us, but maybe our field doesn't have currently have the treatments. I meant to do a bit of a literature search to see if there is any kind of behavior analytic interventions related to fire setting, and I haven't got there. So certainly if folks are familiar with that and want to reach out and share some with me, that's great. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I haven't really looked that hard. I have looked at there is some research around kind of safety and fire safety. I know Dr. Ray Miltenberger in Florida has done a lot of really cool research around I think he's on fire safety, he's done gun safety, he's done some really neat studies. Actually, you might be interested in this, Dr. Collins or Josie. Sorry, some really interesting and sort of in situ kind of research on abuse, where he's actually been able to put Confederates into I don't know how he gets past ethics boards, but he puts Confederates into sort of residential settings with adults with developmental disabilities, and have them kind of do essentially luring kind of behaviors with the individuals, and then teaches the individuals how to respond to those behaviors to sort of avoid abuse. Because I think one thing we know is with sort of abuse intervention, it's really hard to sort of measure outcomes because you can't really test these things out, ethically. But he's been able to somehow find that fine line of actually testing whether some of these interventions work, which is really interesting. And I think he's also done a little bit around fire safety, but I don't know if anyone's done anything around fire setting. So I'm looking forward to digging into that. I also really like that Josie does work in forensic settings, and the company that I work for has a contract with our local forensic psychiatric hospital, and it's sometimes a tough go, and we're going to talk about a paper that Josie wrote with a couple other folks that reinforces how tough a go that is, and how hard it is to kind of implement these things in forensic settings, but still really cool that folks are trying to do that. So that's the plan for today. A little bit on forensics, a little bit on fire setting, maybe a little bit on abuse. And it's wonderful that Josie's doing work in all these areas. I think really can complement a lot of the stuff we're doing. And if anything, maybe some of these strategies will be out of the scope of a behavior analyst, but at least maybe it can start to provide a direction for referrals and whatnot too. If things if we kind of don't know where to send these folks. And certainly if other folks are listening out there, because I think we do have psychologists and other folks from other professions listening out there, and so they might find this of interest. Before we got to get into all the great work you're doing, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about sort of how you got into this field. So sort of from the beginning, I'm thinking, undergrad on, like how'd you come to sort of do what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I guess growing up, I was always interested in crime and why people commit certain crimes, and kind of the more violent crimes like murder I found really interesting. Watching kind of horror films and thrillers, psychological thrillers, and that kind of prompted my interest into psychology, and more specifically forensic psychology. So I kind of pursued that at undergrad and postgrad master's level, and then got a job, kind of did some volunteer work within prisons and got a job within the prison service, and then moved over to secure services, so psychiatric hospitals, inpatient services for offenders with mental health problems, and people with intellectual disabilities as well. So if a person with intellectual disabilities, as I'm sure you know, commits a crime, they might not always be kind of prosecuted through the criminal justice system in the same way as someone without an intellectual disability. So they'll be diverted away from kind of prison services into more secure hospitals where they can receive treatment and the care that they need. So worked within those services as an assistant psychologist for a while, and that was where I first kind of met people that had committed a crime who had an intellectual disability, and autistic people who had kind of been involved in the criminal justice system as offenders and as suspects, but also as victims as well, actually. So met some people who had set fires, but I kind of realised working with these individuals how little we know in terms of assessment and treatment. So that kind of sparked my interest in research and wanting to kind of make a difference in that respect, and to kind of learn more about these individuals. So moved over to the Tizard Centre in Kent, who specialise in research with people with intellectual disabilities and autistic people across kind of a range of settings. So within education, within forensic settings, within the community. So kind of quite broad. Right. Did some research as a research assistant, and then pursued my Ph.D. where I specialised in firesetting behaviour.
And the Tizard Centre, just touching on that for a second, because I know I've been familiar with Tizard for a lot of years. Just came upon it. I'm not really sure how. When I think maybe just doing some research for my thesis 8 or 10 years ago, and discovered works of folks like Dr. Mansell, who I believe did he sort of found the Tizard Centre? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he passed away, sadly, and for folks who are familiar with him, he was a real architect, I think, in the UK around sort of deinstitutionalization and getting folks out of the big buildings and into the smaller ones, as it were, and into community and whatnot. And then I think at some point was Dr. Hastings connected to Tizard ever, or
we do collaborate with
yeah.
Dr. Hastings quite a bit. I'm not sure historically whether he was part of the Tizard Centre, but we definitely collaborate.
Anyway, he was another name that
Richard.
kind of came up early in early days, but then Tizard started discovering some other names that were doing some really interesting research over there, like Dr. Beetle Brown, Dr. Bigby, who we actually had on the podcast already. And looking forward to releasing that around kind of group home culture and that kind of research that she's been doing. And just there's some really neat stuff that's been coming out of the UK for a lot of years that I don't know that folks on sort of our side of the pond are familiar with. And so I just highly recommend folks check out Tizard. I'll put a link in the show notes to Tizard just to kind of learn some more. Folks will be familiar with Tizard if they're, and forgive me, Mr. V. I can't pronounce your last name today, but the wonderful Greek precision teaching expert out at Tizard, whose first name is Thanos. I want to say it's kind of like Vostonis. I'm butchering that, but it's something to that effect. Forgive me, Thanos, for pronouncing it incorrectly. But a wonderful man, and he does. He's been doing these monthly article journal club shares, and where he's invited a lot of folks from kind of our side of the world, as well as your side, who have written some fantastic articles in all areas of kind of behavior analysis. And but I think he's done a really good job of getting that Tizard name known to more folks. But there's a lot of, I think what's interesting is Tizard has a range of different sort of research areas and professions, and so they do have a kind of a BACB, so that's the Behavior Analyst Certification Board kind of track program that I know Thanos is a part of. But then there's also folks doing lots of other things like yourself. You're not a behavior analyst, but you're doing work. It's intellectual disability focused versus just sort of behavior analysis focused. And there's also another term that you folks use in the UK that I think is just important just to mention quickly, as folks are maybe wanting to do research and learn some more. You folks often refer to folks with intellectual disabilities as folks with learning disabilities.
We do, yeah. I tend to use intellectual disabilities because I know that kind of globally that's more recognised. But within services, we'll refer to people as having learning disabilities.
Yeah. One of the early
but we use the term interchangeably.
Right.
So.
And so, of course, for us, learning disabilities are more, things like dyslexia and dyscalculia and sort of those sorts of things, and not necessarily related to, IQ, which maybe is a poor measure anyway. But my early introduction, I think, to the UK was through a guy named Jonathan Beebe, who is I think he owns a PBS company in there, but he was a psychiatric nurse over there. And it's interesting that psychiatric nurses got into ABA over there, and they were one of the early kind of practitioners of ABA. And it's just an interesting connection, because we know psychiatric nurse work a lot in these kind of institutional and forensic kind of settings. And so to see them becoming certified in positive behavior support and those sorts of things is kind of cool, because they've got kind of both sides of different perspectives that they can kind of bring to it. But he was always referring to folks with learning disabilities, and it took me a while to kind of make the connection that this wasn't just all people with dyslexia and whatnot.
We actually call people with like dyslexia and dyspraxia learning difficulties.
There you go.
So if you hear that,
well, that makes sense. But it's just interesting, sort of the different changes in terms, and for kind of going from place to place. So just again, for folks that are doing maybe their literature searches, including learning disabilities, in your search terms may bring out more things. Also, spelling behavior correctly may also bring you some more good information, because I know we in Canada and you folks in the UK have added the wonderful U to the word behavior and made it a much better term. I have a few arguments with folks around the world around the spelling of behavior, and it's mostly in jest, but it's fun. So, there were kind of three areas that I kind of wanted to talk about today with you. You did maybe we'll start with the article that you did on it's called Managing Challenging Behavior Using Applied Behavior Analysis and Positive Behavior Support in Forensic Settings, which again, Josie is not a behavior analyst, but she wrote an article on ABA and positive behavior support. So maybe you could start by telling us why you wrote an article on ABA and positive behavior support, if that's sort of not your area.
Yeah, so when I was working within secure services, although I'm not a behaviour analyst, we did use positive behavioural support with our service users, and that was really the role of psychology. As an assistant psychologist, I'd kind of collaborate with the multidisciplinary team and with the service user to develop a positive behavioural support plan, conduct a version of a functional analysis. So yeah, I was kind of interested in positive behavioural support, but I knew, we know very little about the use of it within forensic settings. So when I moved over to the Tizard Centre, I had the opportunity to work with Peter Baker and Magali Banu around positive behaviour support, and we did a systematic review on what evidence is out there in terms of its use within forensic services, and are there any, what we really wanted to know was what are the challenges to kind of using positive behavioural support in forensic settings, because it's there are restrictions in forensic settings which you sometimes can't avoid, even if you're trying to be work to be least restrictive. The Ministry of Justice will implement things like kind of community leave. If a service user hasn't got community leave, you've got to work around that when implementing positive behavioural support, or access to activities or things like that. So so was really interested to know what the literature was telling us about how people have implemented PBS within forensic settings.
So that's cool. I thought it was interesting from your review. I mean, you went through a lot of articles, and I think you came down to around 29 or 30 that met your inclusion criteria. And I didn't realize maybe that there were that many articles on this topic. But then, kind of after reading through it, I see that a lot of those are those articles that were kind of written back in the 70s and 80s, sort of some of the early ABA research, that because I think a lot of that was done in these. I don't know if it was actually a forensic settings per se, but more so institutions. So these places that we talked about, the deinstitutionalization. These were the places that essentially they house folks with intellectual disabilities since the 17 or 1800s, and there's examples of those all over the world. And so a lot of those studies were in the 70s and 80s, and they were in kind of that hospital setting, and but it was what I really found interesting from your review, and it really tells me I need to kind of go back and look at some of those articles. I didn't realize that a lot of the goals of those studies weren't actually for the benefit of the consumer or the client. They were more to make the staff's lives easier. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that definitely for the more historical articles, it was about making the staff, making things more manageable, kind of easing pressure on staff.
And so that, and again, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, as I tend to do, but that feeds a lot into, and maybe a discussion I'll have with maybe someone over here that that has maybe more connection to those articles, but that feeds a lot into this area of reform that we keep talking about in our field. So behavior analysis is going through a bit of a paradigm shift of sorts, where essentially, and I've said this spiel a few times on episodes, but essentially the George Floyd murders, and I know this seems like a digression, but the George Floyd murders obviously led to a lot of folks in the world, myself included, starting to recognize some of these implicit biases that we had, and how racism sort of affects every part of our lives, and you don't have to be wearing a white coat to be a racist, and in fact, I admittedly, I think, for many years was a racist. I had good intentions behind things. Point being, we started kind of learning about that. What that also did was open the door, I think, for other kind of social justice movements to start getting recognized more. And one in particular has been this neurodiversity movement. And there's been a lot of conversation about the neurodiversity movement, and some folks who support it, some folks who find it problematic. And what that's led to is essentially a lack of what that's come down to is that ABA for a lot of years has seemed to have lacked sort of the input of the consumer, and the values of the consumer, on some level, and there's been a lot of discussion, and I won't sort of get into sort of all the different examples of that. There's several other episodes which I'm happy to link or folks can check out and hear about that. But what I didn't realize, but there's also a reference to the 70s and 80s as being sort of the sketchy time for ABA. There was one particular article, for example, that a couple folks put out where they tried to essentially use behavior analytic procedures to essentially try to convert a young gay boy into a straight boy. In the early 70s, and that's sort of been one of the big sort of quoted articles as being really problematic in our history, and moves to kind of get the study retracted and so on and so forth. And then references to studies that used a lot of sort of punishment procedures and different things and whatnot in the 70s and 80s. But what I didn't know until just reading your review is this point about how the focus was on the staff and not on those individuals. And that really speaks to another kind of area of reform that I think is really important that we're trying to sort of kind of get back to right now. So it was really cool to kind of learn that fact from your study and kind of get that perspective.
Yeah, definitely. But even with the more recent research where, services have tried to implement positive behavioural support, even then the research is really lacking on what the experiences of service users are. So we still need more research, within the more kind of updated stuff that's going on around actually what are the experiences of the service user.
Yeah. The other question I have, and I think this is in your study, and maybe you can elaborate on, is so those studies in the 70s and 80s were not positive behavior support. I mean, the concept of positive behavior support, I think, was just being kind of conceived later in that period, and really didn't kind of come into play until the 90s, really. And it was sort of a move away from restrictive and aversive practices and the use of punishment, the use of restraint, and so on and so forth. I'm curious what the idea of ABA maybe being used in a forensic setting doesn't seem that strange to me, but the idea of people using PBS in forensic settings seems strange to me. Like in the sense that I wouldn't have thought that forensic settings would even want to go there and consider sort of that route, because it's a completely, as far as sort of society goes, if you look at sort of someone who goes to prison, they expect for a major crime, they expect that person to be punished and to suffer or whatever, and not be rehabilitated and not learn or whatever. And who cares about their behavior? Just put them in solitary or whatever. This seems to be the perspective. I'm talking of sort of the community members' perspective, not necessarily the professionals or what maybe is actually happening in those places. But what led to kind of PBS actually being practiced in those settings, at least on your side of the world.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it was a move to more kind of a least restrictive practice, a move to wanting to transition into more community-based services and move people out of big institutions. And the only way to do that, we put people in big institutions, we use punishment as a model, and maybe they weren't very we weren't doing rehabilitation, we weren't doing treatments, and that didn't work. People weren't moving back into the community. They were getting stuck within services for a very long time. So something needed to change in order to get people to transition from institutions to the community. And I think positive behavioural support is a way to do that in a person-centred way. It's about understanding that person's behaviour and understanding the functions of their behaviour and how we can intervene at a much earlier point in order to prevent kind of more challenging, aggressive, violent behaviour in forensic settings.
So that makes sense to me, and I mean that's a similar story over here, but I think it's the forensic setting piece that I'm still wondering about, because over here we've closed most of our institutions. Most, I say, there's still a couple around, but for the most part they're closed. But we do still have forensic hospitals, so the places where folks who are, and I don't know what the legal term is, but essentially, not criminally responsible or mentally incapacitated, incapable, or whatever the term they use, basically saying they don't have the wherewithal to have the intent, or to for that crime, that there's some sort of mental illness or disability that basically played a role. And so instead of going to prisons, they end up in these kind of psychiatric hospitals, which are still operating today, and there's lots of places have them, and I'm sure, and you folks have them. Those places, I'm surprised that those places would want to start using PBS. Was there any reason, or maybe legal change or something, that sort of led folks to start going that direction?
Yeah, well, I guess it's within the inpatient services within the hospitals for people with intellectual disabilities that have been involved in crime and offending type behaviour, the model is rehabilitation and treatment, care and treatment. It's not, we're not kind of advocating for a model of punishment.
Right.
So yeah, the whole purpose is to treat people and have them reintegrate back into the community. So yeah, that's really the kind of aims behind it. And I guess it's come from, where we've had transforming care, where we're trying to we've developed guidelines and policies, like building the right support for people with intellectual disabilities and guidance around that, and legislation around transforming care, and trying to move people out of secure even forensic services. Often sometimes people with intellectual disabilities are in forensic services not because they have a criminal conviction, but because they've had challenging behaviour that has been a risk to either themselves or others. So it might not be that they've actually been convicted of a crime, but they are deemed too risky to be in the community. And you can't, even people that have committed a crime, you can't keep them within a service forever. And, if you're in a prison, you have a release date. So, no matter what treatment you've received, you'll get released by that point. So, it's not fair to keep people with intellectual disabilities within services for, an indefinite amount of time. So ultimately, the goal is to, have people reintegrate back into the community. Right. And positive behavioural support is something that you can start with in a forensic setting, and you can implement certain degrees of it. All right, you might not be able to implement things that you would be able to in the community, but then upon release from a secure service, you would hope that the community would continue that positive behavioural support plan, and continue that within the community and build on that.
And so from this review, is that what seems to happen? Like, does it work, or what did you kind of find out about PBS in those settings?
So actually, there was some really positive outcomes in terms of people wanting to implement PBS.
Oh, good.
And it created an environment that was more person-centered, and it created an environment where the service user was more involved in their care plan, and it was more individualized to their interests, their goals, their aspirations. But there were barriers to implementing it as well. And some of that was around staff training. As you said, not every service will have a BCBA, and not every service will provide lots and lots of training around how to conduct a functional analysis, how to write a PBS plan. So there is elements within the results that came out around staff needing more training around actually how do we do PBS properly.
If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is abuse. Overall, it sounds like PBS can work in those settings, but there's some barriers, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. And there's some limitations to PBS within forensic settings. But I think the positives, if it's implemented properly and it's kind of systemically, and you've got support from leadership and from higher up, and it's not just down to kind of support workers to kind of implement, and it's kind of a strategic approach, I think it can have a really positive impact on service users. But it's got to be done properly, and with staff have got to be trained.
Yeah. This is a bit of a rhetorical question because I don't think you know the answer, because we're talking about sort of over here compared to over there. At least in my experience, and maybe my American counterparts have had different experiences, but we don't see PBS happening in our forensic hospitals. And in fact, there seems to be a lot of resistance to that. We do have, and in fact, even my own company, we have behavior analysts that work with the forensic hospitals to help transition folks out of there and do that sort of piece into the community. But the hospitals themselves don't have anyone that are kind of trained in PBS or behavior analysis, kind of doing that work. And there is one now locally that has started to kind of move that direction. So maybe the change is starting. But I'm curious, I'm wondering if it's, and again, this might just be rhetorical, but I'm wondering if it's because in the UK, it's not just behavior analysts that are using PBS, and that it's psychologists and other folks that maybe weren't trained with that ABA sort of, foundation, but they're still practicing positive behavior support. I think that's similar over in Australia and New Zealand as well, where there's folks practicing PBS that may not necessarily have come from an ABA background. Do you think that's why? Is that because those settings have psychologists in them, like yourself, who are familiar with this idea of PBS and have brought that into those settings?
Yeah, I think so, partly. And I think it's, within services within the UK, it's more of a approach that whereby all staff are involved in PBS. So it might be led by psychology in some services, but actually, particularly when I was involved in PBS, it was all about involving the support workers, the nurses, the service user, and getting as many people involved as possible. Getting the support workers and the people based on the ward to be doing the behavioural observations, because they're the ones that are with service users all of the time. So I think potentially that could be a reason why it's more widely used.
I think what I'm trying to figure out is, and again, I'm not expecting you to have the answer, but is everything you're saying, that's what PBS is all about. It's all about the collaborative approach. It's all about working with the staff, with the managers, with everyone right down in the front line, and really getting that buy-in so everyone really sees the value in it and that person-centered approach. But someone's got to start it. Someone's got to first say, we're going to do PBS here. And there's nobody in the forensic hospitals that I'm familiar with that would do that. And so it's always external folks that are kind of recommending it. And so I guess what I'm wondering is how, and you kind of alluded to this a bit in your introduction to kind of getting into this, but it just seems like it's different in that, at least in the UK anyway, that psychologists, or some of them, have some training or knowledge of PBS, but they're not coming from that ABA background. And I think over here because we know that PBS and ABA are often one and the same, and certainly built upon each other. And really, PBS is just sort of takes ABA and adds that person-centered planning piece, some more preventative stuff, some more sort of maybe wraparound services, and just a lot more kind of collaborative kind of features. But yet, I feel like over on my side of the world, it's a bit taboo, I think, to practice PBS without having an ABA background, without being a board-certified behavior analyst or whatever. And in fact, it's often considered to be out of people's scope to be going there. Yeah, that doesn't seem to be the case over in the UK.
No, and I guess, that might be partly because there's a real push in terms of the NHS and the Care Quality Commission that we have here, in them wanting to see that happening within services and it links to transforming care and, the push to get people out of inpatient services. Mm-hmm. So, if a service says that they're doing positive behavioural support, they appear to be quite person-centred, and they appear to be kind of moving in the right direction. So it's looked quite positively upon during like inspections and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And I also kind of read in the article that I think a lot of this sort of move towards, PBS and whatnot has come out of as a result of some abuse allegations or not maybe allegations, abuse scenarios where, essentially where folks with intellectual disabilities are being abused in these places. And there's a place, and maybe you could just briefly share, because there's a place that I've heard lots about in sort of different aspects, but I don't actually know exactly what happened. There's a place in the UK called Winterbourne, or Winterbourne View, maybe. And was that essentially one of these institutions, or was that a?
Yeah. So there's been a few. So there was Winterbourne View in 2011, I think it was. There's been, since then we've had Walton Hall, which you might have heard of, which is a similar scenario. And basically they're in caring institutions, quite large institutions for adults with intellectual disabilities. And people stayed there a long time. And the kind of Panorama TV program went in undercover. Someone went in undercover with a recording device, pretended to be they were a member of staff, and worked there for a while and recorded a lot of abusive practice, basically. And then that got aired on TV, and led to kind of a scandal of abuse, and lots of other kind of allegations of abuse coming up as well after that, actually. But kind of significantly, that aired, and it was Winterbourne View was investigated, Walton Hall has been investigated, and there were, from those investigations, it became apparent that there were things that led up to the abuse happening. There were things where people had been whistleblowing for quite some time, allegations had been made, so there were indications that this was happening, but it continued to kind of slip through the net and not get detected for quite some time. And quite significant in that it wasn't just one member of staff, it appeared to be kind of a culture within the service. These kind of scandals are what really instigated some new legislation and guidance around how people with intellectual disabilities should be cared for.
Yeah.
And the environment that they should be in.
And just looking at, you said 2011 for Winterbourne View, and then a few years later for Walton Hall. So were these places open then? Like, these places are still running in the 2010s?
Yeah, so there are private hospitals. We still have private hospitals today. Yeah, they are still open. More so now. They're small. Obviously, there are smaller kind of residential services, but there are still larger hospitals open, and quite often people with intellectual disabilities get housed in quite historical buildings, where the layout and the environment kind of not perpetuates, but kind of feeds an environment that is quite abusive anyway, and makes abuse more easier to kind of perpetuate if you're an offender abusing service users. So yeah, and they some private hospitals that are quite large still exist, and some are still getting funded to be built as well to house a lot of people. So it's still an issue that continues to kind of happen.
Well, I think that's a good segue into this other paper that you did, which was basically was kind of a review on abuse of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Can you tell us a little bit about that study and kind of why you did it and what you came up with?
Yeah, so this was we wanted to do kind of a review of the literature of all the literature that we know about abusive practice and detection and prevention of abuse of people with intellectual disabilities within services, and kind of summarise what we know about how abuse is getting detected and how what are the risk factors for abuse, and with the view to kind of share with practitioners, with professionals, with families, with individuals or autistic individuals and individuals with intellectual disabilities, the kind of risk factors and protective factors for abuse, and how we need to move forward in terms of our research in trying to prevent this from happening in the future. Because we're 10 years later, these scandals are still coming to light, which suggests we need to do more, really.
Yeah, and so I think we'll be linking all these articles, and you go through essentially, which is cool. You go through a lot of different risk factors. So, I mean, I think we're familiar with some of the obvious risk factors right now, and folks generally it tends to be men that are perpetrators. Generally, it tends to be females who are on the receiving end. I think when we're talking about physical and maybe sexual abuse, certainly neglect and financial abuse probably falls along a different range of folks. More severe intellectual disabilities, obviously. I mean, that's they become a much easier target when you don't have ability to communicate or sort of those pieces in place. Certainly challenging behavior, folks engage, and this is something we see around the world. Folks engage in severe challenging behavior. We don't have the right sort of training in place, and in order even just to protect themselves, folks are often engaging in abusive behaviors towards these individuals. Hitting back or really unsafe restraints. But on their side of the coin, also, bullying behavior and whatnot. And then I think, but then you go on to kind of talk about what perpetrators look like. And I thought, the male piece, a history with being a perpetrator made sense. Sort of the inability to cope with stresses and whatnot made a lot of sense. Staff perceptions of service users made a lot of sense, but also just kind of reminds me of sort of stigma, and there's some really interesting research on stigma now coming out on kind of how we kind of look at folks. And I actually have an interesting episode coming out with a guy named Rocco Catrone who did an article on essentially the capability of individuals and perceived capability of individuals, that kind of stigma piece, which is really interesting. But what I thought was most interesting of those was that it was newer staff that were kind of more likely to engage in abuse. And and sort of from my experience of I spent a lot of years kind of working in and running group homes and whatnot before I became a behavior analyst, and it seemed to be that the new staff were the ones that were more modern and progressive, and had really positive ideas and seemed to really kind of mesh well with folks. So I thought that was interesting. That was there any sort of reasoning why newer staff versus longer term staff were more likely that you found at all?
No, and I wouldn't be convinced by those findings either. I was kind of I think, there are other factors in play, particularly for that study. And I think, more research needs to be done in terms of what were the other factors going on for that service, because there's stuff around, staff turnover and poor recruitment strategies, actually, that, it might not be the fact that they're newer staff, it might be more organisational factors for that service that are having an impact kind of higher up.
Because I thought it was also interesting that you found that newer staff were more likely to report.
Yeah.
And
so they're more likely to whistleblow.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, but I think it's the organisational factors that, I think that's kind of where we need to be looking more in terms of what we do to prevent this and detect it. In terms of, there are things that can be easily, things like services. If we're thinking about external monitoring and, CQC inspections and how we detect abuse, there are things that can be picked up, such as kind of high staff turnover or kind of poor, inappropriate leadership or weak leadership, poor supervision records, things like that. Lack of staff training. These are things that you can really should quite easily be able to detect. And they kind of a lack of collaboration with community services and kind of a lack of communication with external people. These are things that are indicators that the culture within a service might not be optimal for a caring environment.
And that reminds me now a lot of what Chris Bigby work was talking about. She doing all sort of work around group home culture and sort of the sort of the characteristics of really good group homes and the characteristics of really poorly run group homes. And I imagine it's those poorly run group homes where abuse practices are much more likely able to happen. There was one heading which I didn't read under, but I was hoping you could elaborate on, and it was around some tools to kind of help detect abuse and whatnot. What were those? That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so this was one of the main aims of doing this review, because we wanted to see actually how, we all aim to detect and prevent abuse, but how are we actually doing that in practice? Like, what, how are the ways we're doing that evidence-based, or are we just sending people into services hoping that they'll be able to detect these things? And essentially we found that actually the tools that we've got to detect and prevent abuse aren't, they're not very well researched. But some of the tools we use are around surveillance, and that's something that is quite questionable in terms of the use of CCTV in these types of services and how we use CCTV. And that's kind of a whole other debate. I'm currently writing an article on the use of CCTV in forensic services, which has come out of this review, actually, because, there is some push to use CCTV in terms of monitoring for abuse. And I think sometimes family carers might advocate for that. But there are several, ethical implications of doing that. And the research tells us that actually we aim to kind of use CCTV as a way to prevent abuse. And it's been used in that form, or to, create a sense of security and safety within these services. But there's not evidence to support that. And actually, we don't know if that does, if it does prevent abuse. It could also be used as a way to kind of be more abusive in services if, we're invading people's privacy, we're not getting their consent, especially in kind of bedrooms and, the use of it there. And if we're not using it in bedrooms, then actually, the bedrooms are just an environment where abuse will happen because there isn't that prevention. So that was quite interesting in terms of the tool and the kind of benefits and risks of using CCTV as a tool. But kind of more effective, I think, was in terms of thinking about how we assess the culture of a service, and what tools we use, thinking more about people external going into a service. What tools can we develop to use to kind of assess the culture of a service? And that might just, might not, create, yes, abuse is happening and kind of create a firm conclusion, but it might be something we can use to kind of raise flags, and, put measures in place for further monitoring and kind of more investigative work.
Right. So essentially, this particular program, according to our tool, has a lot of these risk factors in place. And so we don't know if abuse is happening, but it's much more likely it's happening here than this other place where the protective factors are in place, that kind of idea.
Yeah, and services might go years without being investigated, and if professionals, lots of people should be going in and out of these services. There should be advocacy services going in and out, social workers, external visitors. There should be people interacting with professionals, seeing the service day to day. So if we can kind of get those sorts of people more aware of the factors around group home culture, and what that should and shouldn't, the indicators of kind of a poor culture, that might lead to kind of a portfolio of evidence that can then be used where maybe more the Care Quality Commission might then look to visit that service more often, and not leave it so long, for example.
Right. I really like,
obviously resources are limited.
Totally. And I really like the idea of unannounced visits. And I think that's big. Something I've had a lot of experience with is accreditation over here. And there's a lot of our intellectual disability services need to be accredited in order to maintain their funding. And we have, I think there's several sort of major accrediting bodies out here that and some are international. But the problem with them is they're planned. So we know that on June 3rd, 4th, and 5th, the surveyors will be here. And so we put a whole, and we were doing this in the group homes I was in, okay, make sure the house is clean, make sure the files are correct, make sure the money's numbers are correct. Essentially, make sure everything looks really good for the surveyors, for these 3 days. And once they leave, we don't care what you do again.
Yeah, and that was a problem in Winterbourne View and in Walton Hall, whereby the more challenging service users that were perhaps being restrictive, were being abused, were that would be seen as more difficult service users, were being given community leave on the days that inspections were happening, so that they wouldn't be interviewed. This was part of the problem, that actually on paper when inspectors went in, it appeared that everything was fine because people were given leave, or staff members were changed, like the rota was changed so that the disgruntled staff wouldn't be interviewed, or they were directed to the people that would give them the information that would make the service look better. So it's how do you avoid that? And even with there's talk kind of unannounced, because even if they're unannounced, it would be like a Monday to Friday, 9 till 5. But actually, could visits take place in the evenings or at weekends when maybe there isn't so much, the multidisciplinary team might not be in at weekends, so there's kind of less supervision generally within a service. So, what can be done to kind of
that's a big one for sure. Really cool.
And it's lack of time as well. People, inspectors only have so much time to go to a service. It might be that they've got one morning to decide the quality of the service. So it's it's tricky. Really tricky. And they might not have knowledge or training in intellectual disabilities either. So we found that was quite quite a difficulty in that they didn't have the communication skills to be able to interview the service users, and that actually, or have access to communication aids or know how to use those.
Right.
So service users weren't being interviewed when had they been interviewed, they might have been able to kind of share that they weren't happy within the service.
Yeah. Or at least they'd be able to find out that even the service users aren't being taught to communicate or given any sort of tools to communicate through that. Really interesting. Well, I won't dig into that one anymore. It's a really good article. And like I said, I'll put the link to it. It's got a whole lot of really valuable kind of risk factors across, like I said, across staff, across organization, across service users. And then it's got the protective factors across all those areas. So things you can really kind of look at doing to sort of prevent those things. It's a really nice, detailed kind of list of things you can look at and address. But I know, Josie, you do have another appointment coming up in about 45 or so minutes. So I really want to get to the other area that I kind of first kind of found you for, and that's fire setting. So I have very little experience in this area. I shared with you earlier that I am a firefighter, so I definitely have an interest in that regard, and kind of from that lens of sort of learning about how to do preventative education in the community and whatnot around this. I don't know that folks even know this is a thing. I mean, we hear about in the news about arson, and I think arson is sort of the term for the crime. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus sort of the behavior. So the crime of sort of burning something. So if I go into my backyard and spend the whole day burning cardboard, I may enjoy burning, and I may be into fire setting, but I'm not committing arson. I'm not committing a crime, because I'm just burning cardboard in my backyard. If it sets my house on fire, there's another problem. But and so I think that's sort of the difference. What is? I mean, it seems like a silly question to ask, but is there sort of a definition of fire setting?
Yeah, so fire setting is used instead of arson for several reasons. So if we talk about people with arson, we're talking about people that have got a conviction for having set a fire, and not everyone who sets a fire or who destroys, even if it's destroying property through fire setting, they might not have been convicted for it. And particularly when we're thinking about people with intellectual disabilities, it might be seen as challenging behaviour rather than an offence. They might not receive a conviction for all sorts of reasons that we know it's difficult to convict people with intellectual disabilities. So but also people who have a conviction for arson, some people who have who have done arson might not have been convicted for arson. They if they've done it to harm someone or to commit murder, for example, that carries a much larger sentence, they would have been convicted for murder. But so if we're thinking about within research and trying to explore this area, that's why we use fire setting, because it encompasses people that set fires that have and haven't got a conviction. It includes people who set fires to property, to land, to themselves or to other people. It includes people with pyromania, so who have a diagnosed impulse control disorder related to fire setting. So it kind of encompasses everyone really, regardless of status of conviction.
So fire setting is kind of that umbrella term to fit all those things. And sorry, just quickly, you just touched on the compulsive thing. What pyromania? So what is that?
So pyromania is an impulse control disorder. So it's a diagnosis that is within the diagnostic manual, the DSM-5. But actually, few people have that diagnosis of pyromania. It could be as little as 1%. Or less than 1% of people who set fires. So although some people do have kind of an impulsive urge to set fires, that's not the majority of people who set fires.
Oh, interesting. And see, and again, being completely uneducated in this area, I would have looped fire setting, arson, and pyromania as all meaning the exact same thing. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So okay, so are there lots of different ways that kind of fire setting kind of presents itself?
Yeah, so basically from the research that I've done, I wanted to learn more about people with intellectual disabilities. So we know, there's been actually quite a vast amount of research done on fire setting. But most of it's been done on people without intellectual disabilities or autistic people. It's been done on kind of men within the prison service or within psychiatric settings. And ultimately, we've got kind of a theoretical understanding of people who set fires. We've got treatments for people who set fires, and we've got ways of assessing people. But we basically didn't know if any of this applies to people with intellectual disabilities. So my research kind of looked at exploring what are the similarities and differences between these individuals. Are they different, or can we just use all that stuff with people with intellectual disabilities or autistic people? And do in people with intellectual disabilities or autistic people, do they set fires? Is it something that they're engaging in? So my research found that it is something that people with intellectual disabilities and autistic people do. It's a minority of individuals, but it's a behaviour that has quite devastating consequences. So despite it being quite a small population, it's an important area because it can lead to quite drastic outcomes. And that there are some similarities. So a lot of kind of early experiences, demographic features, aggression, impulsivity. These are factors that are quite consistent across groups. But there were some key differences for people with intellectual disabilities, and that was around fire. So they were less interested in setting fire because they, identified with fire, were really interested in fire. It was more, they were motivated much more because they wanted to express how they were feeling, and they wanted more support, or they wanted something to change. So it was kind of a tool for them to kind of achieve an outcome that they were looking for.
I see.
So which was really interesting because it kind of indicated that fire wasn't really the issue. It was much more, you needed to kind of take a much more holistic approach. And that's important when we think about assessment and treatment, because if fire setting isn't the main drive, then it's important not to solely focus on that.
Yeah, and I think that would resonate really well with the behavior analysts in the audience, because we're really talking about behavior function here. And generally we have some, as behavior analysts, we have a lot of really interesting behaviors that folks engage in, aggression, self-injury, elopement, property destruction, which, seems similar to fire setting in some ways. As well as some more sort of how should we put it, behaviors that really grab someone's attention really quickly. So severe self-injury, number one, but then things like fecal smearing and that sort of thing, quite quickly can get their attention. So it sounds to me like there may be more situations here where it's not actually these folks with intellectual disabilities are sitting in their bedrooms dreaming of flames and all that sort of thing, and it's more they've either through happenstance or whatever discovered that if maybe one day they accidentally lit something on fire, lit a match, and a Kleenex went on fire and it set fire to the couch, and it completely changed the game in terms of the attention they got from their caregivers and whatnot, and then now that became sort of forget aggression. I can just get a matchbook out. It's a lot less effort. Certainly a lot. I think self-injury. Obviously, there's a lot of theories around self-injury, but certainly self-injury is probably not a comfortable experience for the individual. Whereas striking a match or flicking a lighter would be a really easy way to get a big bang for your buck, as it. The second secret word is fire.
Yeah, and there's different elements to it. So in terms of that, a lot of people with intellectual disabilities or autistic people are often supported. They might be living in supported accommodation, or they'll have family carers around. So actually, the consequences of setting the fire, they often didn't really understand, because that intervention was quite quick, and like you say, it got people's attention very quickly, and it's very dramatic, and people intervene quickly. So they actually showed a real lack of understanding around kind of the severity of their actions. There were some individuals, they got the kind of less, more of a minority, but there were some that had a circumcised interest in fire, but it wasn't fire specifically. It was maybe it was fire paraphernalia, or it was the emergency services. So they were really interested when the fire brigade came out, or in the uniform. So that was their motivation, or the sensory experience. So watching the flames or feeling the heat, which is different to fire interest, because it comes from a different place.
The sensory side of things, there's another fellow that I supported, who still wonderful young man, but he had such a autistic fellow. He had such a fascination with fire. And I remember distinctively, it's still embedded in my head. This one day we went on an outing, and I drove a little mini school bus, and and he was in the back of the bus. We pulled out. We drove by. We were driving down this road, and we could see some flames in the distance. We pulled over and stopped. We saw this car was completely engulfed in flames. Fortunately, there was nobody in there. It looked like it was just maybe a bomb, or not, something set fire to it, threw gas on it or whatever. His face went up to the window of the bus and just went. He was just in absolute awe and joy watching this flame. He didn't set fires or anything, but I can see that sort of sensory component really kind of playing a role there too. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's important when we think about people's motivations, because if it's more around communication and expressing how they're feeling, that's something that we can intervene quite quickly.
Yes.
It doesn't need to escalate to
Exactly.
kind of fire-setting behaviour. There are interventions that we can put in place beforehand to kind of address those needs, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and you've put a lot of papers out on this, and I know you got a lot more coming out, and I look forward to those. A couple in particular that you put out. You put one out that's called something about a development of a scale called the Adapted Firesetting Assessment Scale, which I think sounds like a really cool tool. And that was built off another study that you did, was called a preliminary fire setting offense chain for adults with intellectual disabilities and other developmental disabilities. So essentially, it sounds like in these studies, you kind of were looking at that motivation piece, and also looking at maybe sort of, again, potentially risk factors or sort of behaviors or circumstances that might lead up to someone moving to fire setting. Because it seems to me like once you start fire setting, that obviously opens up the doors for like so many restrictive practices and so many other sort of really intensive, invasive kind of interventions, which of course folks don't want to do. But again, there's the obvious safety issues there, and so it makes a lot of sense. And again, from that sort of behavior analytic perspective, we know when we're working with severe, challenging behavior, we often try to address the precursor behavior, so the things that lead up to it. So if we know an individual maybe grunts and groans before he, starts, engaging in physical aggression, then we're going to try and provide an intervention at the grunting and groaning, versus at the physical aggression, because that's going to be a lot safer for everyone involved. So it sounds like you may have found some things. So how did you do these studies? How were you able to figure out sort of what led up to sort of fire setting for folks?
Yeah, so initially I did a systematic review on everything we knew about from the literature about fire setting for people with intellectual disabilities, and that was interesting because that I found like 100 studies that I found that included people with intellectual disabilities, which is a lot. So you'd think that we'd know a lot, but actually we know very little, because these people had been included within much broader groups of fire setters, and the differences between the groups hadn't been kind of deciphered. They'd just kind of been included amongst the much larger group. So I went on to I interviewed only 13 actually, partly because of COVID, adults with intellectual disabilities and autistic individuals who had set a fire. And I know some people would say, why did you include both groups within your analysis? And there are pros and cons to that, because there are quite substantial differences between those with intellectual disabilities and autistic people who set fires. And in an ideal world, I would like to have kind of recruited enough for both groups to kind of look at that separately. But I tried to kind of tease out the differences between the groups in my analysis. But essentially, I interviewed 13 individuals and basically got them to tell me what had happened in their lives from kind of childhood all the way through to the point of setting the fire.
Wow.
And that was interesting because differences kind of became apparent throughout their life, and things that would be important for us to kind of know in terms of where we can assess people and how we can intervene earlier. So people without intellectual disabilities tend to set fires. They tend to have quite a broad criminal offending history, quite versatile, might have been involved in kind of violence, property damage, aggression before, but actually people who with intellectual disabilities actually didn't have that kind of versatile long history of offending. It might have been their first offence, or they might have been reported for kind of challenging behaviours, but never really been involved in the criminal justice system. So that was quite interesting. But also their kind of lifestyle could be quite antisocial in terms of they didn't really have any kind of structure or no kind of volunteering work or employment. Their accommodation was pretty unstable. They moved around a lot throughout their life. Were in kind of social services, foster care, and lots of different placements from childhood through to adulthood, and were quite socially excluded actually. So within an educational establishment, often they were excluded from school, but also within the community, they might have been excluded from services quite a lot, or excluded from the community because of their intellectual disability, or kind of poor communication skills, social skills difficulties. And there were real difficulties with relationships from early childhood all the way through to adulthood. Quite poor attachment styles with parents. Often experiencing bereavement as well was quite common for these individuals. Interestingly, I found that quite a few had parents or a relative that was a firefighter.
Interesting.
So that was really interesting, yeah. And I think that kind of stems from kind of social learning theory, and kind of having that role model, and obviously seeing someone use fire as a positive, having that in their life, and kind of taking elements of that and using it in a negative way as an adult. So I thought that was really interesting.
That is interesting, and I can pipe in and relate to this one a little bit. Being a firefighter, I don't have children myself, and maybe that's a good thing after this conversation. But it's true. I mean, I do, and I could see like a firefighter at home having these kinds of conversations where, obviously our concern is most for the people and their safety and protecting folks and protecting their homes. But at the same time, and I see this myself, and I see this in a lot of the kind of firefighter sort of social media groups I'm in, firefighters are really fascinated by super big fires and big explosions and big flames and there's an adrenaline rush and thrill to be able to kind of get that close to that heat and put that fire out. And I could certainly see, a context where these are common discussions, and you've got an individual with intellectual disabilities who maybe potentially takes things quite literally, or, doesn't understand sort of all the nuanced pieces. And they're like, my dad thinks fire is really cool. I should think fire is really cool. So I could totally see that connection happening now that you say it, but I would not have put that together. The third secret word is offender.
Yeah, and I think we need to understand it a bit more, because I think it's interesting, because there's that perspective, but there's also the perspective of wanting to be the hero and setting a fire and then extinguishing it as well.
Ah, very good, yes.
Which is a different take on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, it's difficult for us to know how that did impact. I couldn't say, but
sure.
Interesting.
So, and I won't get you to list them all, but again, the article. The article on the actual Adapted Firesetting Assessment Scale, so you come up with it looks like 41 items on the scale. So I'm certainly not going to get you to list them all, but I'll just read a couple of them that I thought were kind of interesting. So things like fire is very important to me. I need fire in my life. I must have fire in my life. I like watching fires get bigger. I think these are the ones that sort of, most of us who don't know much about this would make the assumption, that sounds more like that kind of, obsession kind of sort of perspective. But then look at some of these other ones, like people often set fires when they're angry. Most people carry a lighter with them. they should teach you how to stop fires at school. The police talk to lots of people about setting fires. I know how to stop a fire. We already mentioned I'd like to be a firefighter. Seeing a firefighter put their uniform on. So again, we talk about, your point about the emergency services and the fire break. I like watching a fire engine come down the road. I'm like, there's a lot of these sorts of watching people run from a fire. And then certainly some more, a few violent ones, like watching a person with their clothes on fire. And then maybe more kind of, seemingly tamer ones, like watching a fire burn in the fireplace or watching a campfire. I mean, I know I love staring at the flames in a campfire. I could go in a trance anytime. So I presume that this is a scale that you've obviously come up with some sort of, and I haven't totally read through the article, but some sort of scoring protocol. So just because I have a lighter in my pocket doesn't mean I need to be treated for fire setting. How does it kind of work?
Yeah, so the scale looks at several factors. So it looks at fire interest, so how interested someone is in fire, and at the point at which that becomes problematic. It looks at whether someone identifies with fire, and what I mean by that is it kind of part of do they see it as part of who they are, so kind of integral to their personality. And whether, it looks at normalization of fire. So do they think it's quite normal to, be around fire quite a lot, to set fires, to see kind of things on fire? Is that quite normal for the individual? And it looks also at fire safety awareness. So kind of having knowledge of fire safety. So those are kind of the 4 factors that the scale is looking at.
I see.
I basically gave the scale to people who had set a fire with intellectual disability and people that had committed an offence but it wasn't related to fire setting. So we can kind of determine whether the questions can differentiate between those two groups. So were people's scores higher? So what I basically found was people's scores were higher if they'd set a fire, which suggests that these questions do determine whether someone is at risk of fire setting, in terms of the fire related factors. But obviously we've talked about lots of other factors that are relevant to fire setting, so this is kind of one element of an assessment that you might do with an individual. If someone isn't interested in fire at all and they set it because they wanted to move accommodation, they didn't want to be in their prison cell, for example, then you might not necessarily use this scale because it might not be helpful.
Right. So essentially, and again, and I'm sure if I had read the whole thing, I would have put it together that basically it, like a lot of assessments, the items are broken into different categories and then sort of scored and weighted and whatnot, and from there you can get different levels of risk, I guess.
Yeah, so that's the ultimate aim. So at the moment we're basing it on the 4-factor fire scale, which was developed by Okada in 2015, and I've adapted that. So
I see.
So because the research was done during COVID, my original target was to recruit kind of 200 plus people. Unfortunately, I was only able to recruit 59 individuals. So the plan is to do another pilot study kind of post-COVID.
Gotcha.
And share this with a lot more individuals to kind of get enough data to be able to do just that and kind of create some meaningful cut-off scores potentially.
Cool. So before we get into kind of the treatment side of things, is this an assessment that's available? Like, can folks access this and use this?
Yeah, definitely. And if you can't, you can email it to me and I'm happy to share it.
Okay.
So it's accessible. There are limits to it in terms of its validity, and we know it's got retest reliability, but there is more kind of empirical research that needs to be done with it. So it has its limits, but it's also grounded in the previous research.
Right.
So it does have its limits, so it needs to be used kind of with that in mind,
Yep.
but it's definitely something that services are using
Yeah.
because the current measures for people, they don't have the visual aids. The
Right.
language is quite confusing,
Yeah.
and I've certainly used his other measures for people with intellectual disabilities, and the items don't make sense to some individuals.
Right.
So it's a step in the right direction, I think.
Gotcha. Does it tend to be? I mean, obviously, folks need to be able to answer these questions. So, are there examples of folks with more severe intellectual disabilities fire setting as well? But obviously, you couldn't ask these questions of.
Yeah, so the majority of the participants, I would probably say, are kind of mild intellectual disabilities that this was used with, or autistic individuals. But yeah, people with more severe learning disabilities might find it still too complex, and need it adapting further. And I think within the research more broadly, we need to be thinking kind of more creatively about how we can assess these things. And it's, a questionnaire isn't always the best way to do that. And yeah, thinking about other assessment methods like, looking at someone's physical reactions to situations, using open questions in an interview style. So, there are other methods of assessment as well, which I think we could be more kind of creative about, thinking about, using technology a lot more to do assessments as well.
Cool. Now, kind of getting into treatment, because obviously we want to try to do something about this once we assess that piece. As you said, there's a dearth of research on fire setting in sort of folks without intellectual disabilities or not autistic and whatnot, and there are treatment programs in place, and there's one in particular that you referred to, which was called the FIPMO. So, what is the FIPMO, and how did you how's it work, and then how did you kind of adapt it for folks with intellectual disabilities, and did it work?
So the FIPMO is the Fire Setting Intervention Program for people with a mental disorder.
Okay.
There's also the FIP as well, which is the Fire Setting Intervention Program for prisoners. So these two programs have been developed by Teresa Gannon and colleagues, and Nicola Tyler and colleagues. They've kind of developed these fire setting intervention programs, and they are continuing to evaluate them. So within services for people with intellectual disabilities, there hasn't been a great deal of research done in terms of treatment. So the options are to use the FIPMO for people with mental disorders. Potentially that has some applicability. There is another program that's been developed by Taylor et al. But that hasn't been for people with intellectual disabilities specifically. But it hasn't been kind of sufficiently evaluated in terms of a large population or in terms of a randomized control trial. So basically there isn't kind of a reliably valid and effective treatment out there for people with intellectual disabilities. Arguably, clinicians have the skills to adapt materials to suit this population, but we know from the wider literature around other offences, so I'm thinking predominantly sexual offending, where a lot of research has been done, we have adapted sex offender treatment programmes. We wouldn't pick up a manual for someone with an intellectual disability and just use that. So if we're doing that for sex offending, why aren't we doing it for fire setting? And if we're thinking about some of the differences that my research has highlighted in terms of the two populations, people with intellectual disabilities, we need to be taking a more kind of multidisciplinary systemic approach, and possibly also a more trauma-informed approach because of the kind of histories of some of the perpetrators. So I think it might not be. I think an adapted fire setting intervention program would be useful. It's something that I would like to do kind of going forwards and evaluate. I know services are adapting their own versions of programs and running kind of in-house programs, but we don't know if they're effective. So we need some robust research on that. But also being mindful actually of the other factors that are important for people with intellectual disabilities, and not getting into this trap of someone's got to do a fire setting intervention program because that was their behaviour. We're thinking back to around kind of PBS, thinking about what was the function of that behaviour, is it relevant to put them on a program that actually, it wasn't the fire setting that was the issue really.
Fair
it was
enough,
much broader. So I think for some individuals, an adaptive version of a fire setting treatment program would be useful, certainly. And I think hopefully that's something that we can look to develop. But at the moment, we don't really have an effective treatment program.
Oh,
that we
okay.
know that's effective.
Oh, I see.
The FitMo might be effective, but we haven't evaluated it with people with learning disabilities.
I see. So the FitMo right now is just being used with folks without the intellectual disabilities.
It might well be being used with folks with intellectual disabilities,
right?
But there's no evidence to suggest that.
Right.
It works.
What is that program essentially? Like, what does that involve?
So, it involves looking at people's motivations for their fire setting.
Yep.
Thinking about their triggers for why they set the fire. It focuses a lot on cognitions and kind of changing cognitions. Thinking about kind of offence supportive beliefs. So if people think, no one is harmed when I set a fire, then they're more likely to set a fire. Whereas actually, if you thinking about victim empathy and thinking about who is affected by the fire and the impact, kind of getting people to kind of reflect on that a little bit. But also thinking about if they've got mental health issues as well, how that's impacted on their fire setting.
Right.
So one thing that didn't get integrated into my scale, which I think would be important due to kind of comorbidities being quite high in people with intellectual disabilities, is around kind of mental health and things like, auditory visual hallucinations. If they've had an impact on the fire setting, what are the kind of early warning signs where people can kind of, recognise when they're at risk of risky behaviour, basically.
Yeah. So it sounds kind of a bit like a CBT kind of model, like a cognitive behavior therapy kind of thing, and working with your thoughts and trying to change your sort of thinking patterns so you'll change your behavior and whatnot. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And we have seen some evidence certainly that CBT in and of itself is helpful for folks that are autistic and have intellectual disabilities. But I hear you. There's I really like your point that, okay, Bob set a fire, we shouldn't just put him in the FitMo, because there are so many. I really like the idea of, and it's complex and it's going to take a lot of research, and I'm glad you're young to do this research because because you're right. There's just so many different angles you can come at this from a preventive standpoint. Like, does it have anything to do with fire? Does it have more to do with childhood trauma? Does it have more to do with this or more to do with that? And so, it's definitely not a one-size-fit-all kind of cookie-cutter approach that's going to solve this problem, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really important when we're thinking back to being kind of least restrictive, because often people in services that have a history of fire setting get stuck because it's such a risky behaviour.
Yes.
Community services don't want to take the risk.
Yes.
And it's about understanding that behaviour and not a treatment program becoming a barrier to discharge. Often services are low resourced, and it might be that they can't offer a certain treatment group, but other things can be done to address the treatment needs, and it won't always necessarily be a fence type program.
It's a troublesome thing when you have sort of one sort of bad episode on your file, the one day, and maybe the fire was completely accidental, who knows, but and that then now locks you into these almost literally into these kind of forensic psychiatric services, and you never get out, which can be a struggle. And I imagine there's probably scenarios too where I think we see this for other behaviors, certainly, where folks get into sort of forensic services for one thing and then engage in new challenging behaviors in the forensic services because of all of those sort of, positive behavior support related pieces aren't in place, and good environment, good relationships, good oversight, all those sorts of things, just sheer boredom. and they start engaging in new challenging behaviors. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's probably examples of folks that maybe started fire setting in the forensic hospital, in some way.
Yeah, sure. Certainly one of the participants that I interviewed, that was exactly the case. They set a fire because they knew that if they did that, they would be moved accommodation, and they were getting bullied and no one was listening to them. And they set the fire and it worked. And then you have that kind of issue of reinforcement that, okay, it's worked this time. It kind of then encourages that behavior.
Absolutely.
Because
that's the simple laws of behavior to the behavior scientists out there. That one attempt was so strongly reinforced that why would you try any other method to sort of achieve your means? Really fascinating. I wasn't sure that and it wasn't a goal, but I sort of thought this conversation wouldn't really relate as much to sort of behavior analysis and the work that behavior analysts are doing, but the entire conversation did. Like, I really think there's going to be a lot of value specifically for the behavior analysts, but also for some other folks. And, who knows, maybe some of these folks will be reaching out to you and your colleagues to maybe do some collaboration on that end, because I imagine it's a thing that behavior analysts run into and have no idea kind of what to do about it. So really cool. Before we kind of wrap up, you did mention you were kind of doing some other research. I know it sounds like you and probably many researchers that do sort of, research with human subjects are kind of redoing studies that they tried to do during COVID that didn't go so well or weren't able to do, or like you said, could only get a few participants and now we got to get a lot more. So I imagine you're probably doing some of that. But what other kinds of things do you kind of have, on the docket that you're working on as far as sort of, new work or sort of reinforcing the work you're already doing?
Yeah, so something that I'm working on at the moment is, as I said, around the use of CCTV in services, and the kind of legal implications and ethical implications of that. Something else I'm looking to do is think about how volunteer police cadets are supporting autistic young people. So, which is quite interesting, a little bit different. And kind of looking at the perspectives of autistic cadets, their family carers, and then the cadet leaders, and how best they can be supported, and why they're interested in becoming involved in the police cadets as well. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Something else I'm looking at is related to burnout in staff within services, and how staff can, how we're measuring burnout and what that looks like in terms of challenging behaviour, and whether staff who work with people with challenging behaviour are more burnt out than staff who don't.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's quite interesting as well.
Really cool, really cool. Well, Josie, this was such a fascinating conversation. I learned so much today about stuff that I had assumptions on that you've clearly erased, and just changed my whole thinking about fire setting, certainly about abuse, just the concept of kind of what happens in these sort of forensic settings. Just really, really neat research that you're doing, and definitely gonna keep following what you're doing, and maybe we'll have you back again when you've done some of the bigger studies, and we can talk some more about it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also, one thing I should mention is that I'm working with Professor Glynis Murphy on an evaluation of a sex offender treatment program for people with learning disabilities. So that's really going to be a really important study as well.
Yes, we're definitely going to have you back to talk about that one. I think that would be really interesting. Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks again for being on the show, Josie. So awesome.
It's been great talking with you. Thank you.
Wonderful.